Scott Morrison won last year's election, at least in part, by exposing that Labor had not got any better with numbers. Be it the $200 billion in new or increased taxes, hits on families, hits on retirees, or the colossal mistake of an uncosted plan to cut emissions by 45%, Australians just didn't buy Bill Shorten's argument that the cost of inaction was more important and that taxpayers should give him a blank cheque. They didn't buy it then and they won't buy it now, and Scott Morrison knows this. Having won the last election in part by stressing that you don't sign up for anything without knowing the full cost, Morrison knows he would surely lose the next election by signing up to a policy for net zero emissions by 2050 without knowing exactly what it would mean for our country. But don't for a second underestimate the pressure that will come on the Prime Minister to do just that. Boris Johnson will host the next climate change summit in Glasgow in November. He will use all his considerable charisma to pressure allies like Australia to go along with net zero emissions. Johnson is not naturally a climate change zealot. But the Tories took a left turn, quite literally, on these sorts of issues a while back under David Cameron. It's caused them grief ever since, but well, Cameron was hardly a brains trust when it came to judging the mood of the ordinary British voter. After all, he promised a Brexit referendum because he was certain people would vote to remain, and we all know how that turned out, don't we? But in any event, emissions don't matter so much for Britain as for us, given that coal, gas and agriculture are not such a big part of their economy, at least not anymore. Nor do Britons routinely need to fly in that they have other options, unlike us. And in terms of blue-collar jobs, Britain long ago exported most of its heavy industry to China. Now, naturally, the EU, Canada and New Zealand, well, they're all clamouring that Australia must sign up, even though these players say one thing but deliver quite another. China, of course, will demand that all Western countries commit because it's a form of unilateral economic disarmament that it can force on its strategic competitors while completely ignoring any constraints on its own development. In the Australian media, the usual suspects will demand Scott Morrison sign up to net zero emissions, and almost none of them will take the next step and ask what this might mean for the economy. Indeed, surprisingly, for an organisation that argues for sound policy, the Business Council of Australia, it's urged the government to sign up to this target now, net zero emissions, and they say, this is the BCA, worry about how to get to the target later. Now, the BCA, which represents 80 of our largest public companies, needs their head read if they think this sort of position makes any good governance sense. Imagine their reaction if a CEO went to the board demanding that the company achieve some significant target without a clear plan of how to get there and without all the costs and jobs and benefits clearly identified and accounted for. Well, the CEO would be sacked and or face the courts. Yet the BCA, like so many others in this space, has decided to look good by making promises that others will have to keep. And when you're a big corporate or a well-paid CEO, let me tell you, you're insulated from so much of the pain because money talks. Not so for small and medium businesses, and certainly not so for ordinary Australians, families and those on fixed incomes. Let's be very clear about what achieving global net zero emissions will mean. It won't just mean the end of using coal in this country, it will mean the end of our two biggest exports, coal and gas. It won't just mean the end of cheap flights to Bali in Europe, it will mean the end of our third biggest export, education, to all the foreign students who fly here, as well as tourism. And it won't just mean the elimination of farmers' herds, it will mean the virtual elimination of meat from Western diets. Now, is this really what we want? And what will this country actually do to pay its way if there's no mining, there's no coal, there's no gas, there's no grazing, there's no agriculture, if we don't make things anymore and we can't fly in or off this island for a fair price? I can't see any Australian voting to lower our standard of living. So how exactly do people think we're going to pay for our pensions and hospitals, roads and schools? Everyone should understand that net zero emissions mean a radical transformation. If that's clearly understood and put to voters at an election, fair enough. But if it happens by stealth, by the corporates and the globalists telling us to set the target and just worry about how to get there later, and no say from the electorate, then all Australians need to understand why they're doing that. Paul Keating famously once said, if you don't understand it, don't vote for it, and if you do understand it, you'll never vote for it. That's where we are now headed. Policies that don't just mean more on our power bills and a few more ugly wind farms. Now it's about changing everything. And make no mistake, this is the biggest test of his mettle that Scott Morrison has ever faced. To his credit, so far, the Prime Minister is insisting he will never sign up to anything that will hurt families, hit pockets or cost Australian jobs. But the pressure to fudge or to concede the principle while quibbling over how you might achieve it will be extreme. Sometimes it's what you don't do rather than what you do that's the real test of leadership. And the job of all of us, me in the media, you at home, is to ensure all Australians really understand what's at stake.